Welcome to Truth, Money, and Freedom. Today is Wednesday, April 24th, 2019. We have an interesting story here on Zero Hedge today. The title of the story is "The Fed is Resigned to Blowing the Biggest Bubble Ever Just to Extend the Expansion." And what it's basically talking about is the continuation of existing policy, low interest rates, and also printing more money. Which is how we got into this mess in the first place. I have with me here today Conjecture from our Discord group, also named Truth, Money, and Freedom. Hey, welcome to the program, Conjecture.
Hey, thanks. I'm glad to be on, Tim.
All right, well, I tell you what, I've read this article, and I try really hard not to read the entire article to the audience because they're kind of dry and boring. I try to summarize, but I'm going to go ahead and read off a paragraph right now real quick. And it's basically it's talking about the fact that the Fed absolutely understands what they're doing, because some people may say, well, gosh, the Federal Reserve wouldn't do this. But let me read it to you. But it is the Fed's willingness to continue down this path, despite seeing the dangers, that is disturbing. It's a classic example of putting a band-aid on a problem, now at the cost of the future. Holding rates down while pursuing maximum employment and 2% inflation is a policy that is proven to lead to disaster. Okay, 2% inflation. That bothers me that it's even in the story. That is a fake number. It's very fake. In fact, Conjecture has posted some very interesting graphs here that help us understand a little bit more. We've done this in earlier videos, but it is important to understand. The Federal Reserve says we are currently at a 2% rate of inflation, CPI. But that number does not include gasoline. It doesn't include the cost of tuition, in other words, schooling. It doesn't include medical costs, pharmaceutical costs, nor does it include, groceries or even housing. What it does seem to have, based on my best information, is electronics and clothing. So the real number is actually between 9 and 10%. And that's from John Williams at shadowstats.com. That's his chart. And actually, since 2001, we've averaged really close to 10%, about 9.8% since 2001. So, Conjecture, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, the inflation has been quite high. I've seen even on the lower end estimates done by a few private groups that in 1 year we experienced 8% inflation in the price of food.
Yep, 8% inflation. And so, the 2% number is really ridiculous. I think most thinking people that actually go to the grocery store, that have actually bought a vehicle or, purchased a new home, or, did virtually anything, sent a kid to school, had to go to the hospital, has to buy medications. I'm sure they know that 2% inflation is not correct. But
Yeah, what the government leaves out is everything they've helped blow into.
Yep, they've blown it into a big bubble. In fact, we'll get back to the bubble here in a second here. If you don't mind, Conjecture, I'm going to go ahead and read off Trump's tweet that's also encompassed in the story. This is from
Do you
Donald Trump.
mind if
Go ahead.
I give my rendition?
Sure, go for it, man.
If the Fed had done its job properly, the stock market would have been up 5 or 10,000 points, and the GDP would have been well over 4% instead of the puny 3% at which it sits, with almost no inflation. Quantitative tightening being the real killer.
Yep. Well, shall we tear this one apart and talk about? Let's bring some honesty to the tweet. Shall we do that, Conjecture?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, man. You go for it. You tell us what 5,000 to 10,000 additional points means on the Dow.
Well, that would be across the board in the stock market.
Yep. Well, actually, 5 to 10 trillion dollars. Not additional points, but 5 to 10 trillion additional dollars in the Dow. And I'm sorry, man. If you said that, you cut out. So I just went ahead and said that part. And
Thanks.
no problem. And quantitative tightening was a killer and should have done the exact opposite. Uh, are we quantitative tightening anymore, conjecture, in your opinion?
Well, I really don't believe so. They said they were going to be ending quantitative tightening, but what they've really said was we're going to stop shrinking our balance sheet, but instead we will get rid of the toxic assets like the CDOs, those nasty derivatives, and fill their portfolio with treasuries.
That's right, and that's called monetizing the debt because the Federal Reserve is taking in cash off of selling, whatever financial products it has on its balance sheet, and instead of destroying the cash, they are actually using it to buy treasuries, and that's called monetizing the debt. And let me get to the bottom of this article here, which is the final paragraph, and that's kind of a conclusion here. And then we're going to get into a few other numbers with conjecture real quick. But the final paragraph reads as follows: Ultimately, the Fed indeed has no choice. Either it inflates away the debt, which there is or which in where MMT will come in very handy in a few years as helicopter money is unleashed under the guise of quantitative easing for the people, or it's a game over for the status quo anyway. If it means creating the biggest asset bubble in the process, so be it. If that's not a suicide bomber going into the heart of the financial system, I don't know what is. What do you think, conjecture?
I think they are committed on a policy of self-destruct.
Yeah, it seems that way too. But honestly, that's really the only way they can go because the Fed would never deflate if it had a choice. It would not allow deflation because that kills governments and banks. But let's look at some of the other. Go ahead, conjecture.
I mean, if you'd pull up the M1 chart,
Hmm.
we're kind of getting a form of deflation against their will in which they've out.
Yep. So we're getting deflation. And thank you again for bringing up the chart because it does show us that we are, right now, we have just entered in the longest economic expansion in American history, following the previous longest expansion, which was through the 90s through 2001. But we have officially, as of this month, April of 2019, surpassed the economic expansion of the 1990s. And look at the money velocity going down during that entire expansion. Now, what conjecture would point out to you, and I'm, follow here with my mouse, is that economic expansion actually goes up during times when the economy is expanding. So velocity goes up, and you can see that very easily. There's a few anomalies here, like in the 80s where it did go down, but it went back up. In the case of the longest economic expansion in human history, or in American history anyway, it has very steadily gone down. It's a very easy to follow trend. So something's wrong here. And conjecture, what do you think is wrong here?
Well, people are not spending.
Okay,
They could be, as what's her name,
Lynette
Lynette
Zhang.
Zhang said. She has two explanations for this, in which she believes both play a part. The big guys, or the big players in this game, are withholding their funds. They're holding $300 billion in physical cash, not in a bank account, but in physical cash. And to top things off, we have people who are barely able to afford groceries, who have to get their groceries on credit cards, and people are so buried up to their eyeballs in debt that they are barely able to service it, if at all.
Hmm. That's pretty much the size of it too. That explains the M1 velocity chart from the Federal Reserve in a nutshell. Is people withdrawing money out of the system and holding it in the form of cash, basically in their mattress, not in a bank account. I suppose it could be in a bank account, but the other part is, of course, the American public is tapped out on credit. So, okay, let's move to the next chart, which is the M1 money stock. You want to talk about this one a little bit, conjecture?
Well, I mean, as you can see, from about 1970-ish to about 2000, we went from just over $300 billion to about 1.2 trillion. You know, we essentially um, nearly quadrupled the money supply over about 40 years, which is about a doubling about once every 20 years or so.
Hmm.
However, in this last expansion, we have doubled the money supply, actually more than doubled it, just in the last 10 years alone.
Yep. In fact, it's pretty safe to say we've tripled it actually in the last 10
Yes.
years. So basically, as conjecture stating here, once again, you get recessions as bars, just like in the earlier graph. But in this period of quote unquote unprecedented prosperity, which is what they like to say, the amount of money being printed is astronomically high. This is a result of quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. And this money largely went to the big banks. And so, at any rate, I think it's very important to understand that this is not a real economic expansion, because the expansion was paid for by brand new money being injected into the system. And that's what this chart here illustrates. So basically, once again, this chart illustrates how much money the Federal Reserve prints and how much is in existence because of the printing. So if you look at, once again, from 2009 to current date, we basically tripled the physical money supply. Okay, let's take a look at the last chart from John Williams at Shadow Stats. Remember now in the story there was 2% inflation mentioned, and that bugs us both. 2% is not a real number. It's given to us by the Federal Reserve, and basically the Federal Reserve has extracted everything from CPI numbers. They've taken out gasoline, they've taken out homes, which is a big part of our economy, by the way. Home sales is a big part. They've taken out auto, they've taken out groceries, they've taken out student loans, they've taken out medical and pharmaceutical. And as near as I can tell, pretty much everything that's left is electronics and clothing and maybe a few textiles. So that's pretty much about it. So the real rate of inflation, as you can see here on the chart, as evidenced in 2001, has pretty much been about 10% on average since 2001. That's 10% a year. And that should bother everyone who is listening to this video, because inflation is a bad thing. It steals the wealth of the money that you make, or money that you have in savings, really. So, conjecture, do you have something to say on this?
Yes, the government has taken everything out that they've been blowing into a bubble and leaving us with this fake, 2% CPI figure. If you take John Williams' shadow stats minus their figure, which comes out to roughly 7%, so about 7% of the inflation we've seen in just this last year is from the bubbles.
Hmm. So, that's what happens when you print a lot of money, basically. And by the way, the money printing actually did start in 2001, and that was with the Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan. He printed money because of the stock market, the dot-com bubble collapse. So that actually started a process of putting a lot of money that was sloshing around in the system, which ended up going into home mortgages. And in fact, not just home mortgages, but it was the subprime market that absorbed a lot of that economic energy. And of course, we had a housing bubble pop. And then that led to the death of the United States economy, and indeed probably the world economy. But they went ahead and printed money to go ahead and blow the bubbles back up again. And that went into the bond market, the stock market, and the real estate market. So basically, what we're saying, when the everything bubble pops, all three of those assets will go down simultaneously. So with the story, we'll go back to the original story real quick, if we will. And in the story, we're talking about, once again, the Federal Reserve is resigned to blowing the biggest bubble ever just to extend the expansion. If you have any thoughts, conjecture, on when this bubble may pop, or when, basically when the bow breaks, the cradle will fall. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Unless the Fed starts lowering rates and they also end quantitative easing, the bubble should pop by no later than mid 2020.
My thoughts are the same, and it's based on the basically the yield curve inversion in the bond market, um, because that's where the smart money actually gets to tell us and give us a little bit of advance notice on what their intentions are. So we had a yield curve inversion from the 1 month Treasury all the way to the 10-year Treasury, and that happened in March. That was completed in March. Now, it didn't go all the way to the 30-year, didn't even go to the 20-year, but it went to the 10-year. So, in my opinion, that's already happened. That's done. So basically, we should be expecting a recession within 6 to 12 months, in my opinion. Now, does that mean we have a bubble collapse in 6 to 12 months? No, no. I'm just talking about a simple recession, but that's usually how these things start. Conjecture, I'm thinking about wrapping up the video, so I'll ask you if you have any final thoughts.
My final thoughts are the same as one of the previous occasions I've been on here. We present this information to you, the audience, so that you may be aware of what is to come, and get yourself into a position in which you will not be caught flat-footed.
Yep. And examples of what conjecture just said is certainly take care of your debt, pay off your debt, don't incur any new debt, even if things are looking up. It still doesn't matter. The yield curve inversion has happened. We have giant, giant asset bubbles, especially in the bond and derivative markets. When they pop, basically you want to be positioned, but the positioning is very simple in my opinion, is precious metals and cryptocurrencies. By the way, I'm not a financial consultant. That's what I've done for myself and my family. Storable food is also a good idea, but get out of debt. That's the people who are going to be hurt the most are those who are in debt, because you will have whatever you have in debt taken away from you, and that includes your home. So you may want to consider that when people start losing their jobs and everything, and they can't afford their house payment anymore, just like what happened in 2008, except it'll probably be a little faster. Is that the advice you give to people too, Conjecture?
Roughly speaking, same note about not being a financial advisor. It is merely a suggestion.
Yep, yep, merely a suggestion. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I think I'll wrap up this video. I want to first of all thank you very much, Conjecture, for joining us this evening to cover this story here. It's an important story. And it basically hints that the Federal Reserve has basically hinted now that they're going to continue pumping this as long as possible. And that may be good news or bad news, depending on your point of view. It's good news if you still have debt and you haven't got any silver or gold or crypto or storable food. Um, but it's in a way it's bad news, because the longer they kick the can down the road, the worse the actual event will be when the bubble does pop. So keep that in mind as you make your preparations. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to listen to our podcasts. Give us a thumbs up, give us a comment, and if you like, you can even join us on Discord. It's free. The link is below in the description section if you want to join in on the conversation. You all have a wonderful evening. God bless you all.